Have you ever felt small in the face of a giant challenge? Have you ever looked at an impossible situation and wondered if there was a way out? The story I'm going to share with you today is exactly about that. About a young pastor who faced the impossible, armed only with faith, courage, and 5 smooth stones. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss any stories that strengthen the soul, calm the heart, and bring light to difficult days. Today we'll walk together through the valley where 2 armies lay paralyzed by fear. We'll meet the giant who terrified multitudes, and most importantly, we'll discover the secret of a heart that trusted God more than its own eyes. Stay with me, relax, adjust the sound, and let's begin. Imagine an entire kingdom holding its breath, waiting for its leader to make the right decision. But he hesitates. Saul had been chosen to guide Israel, but something within him began to crack. First came impatience when he waited for Samuel, then arrogance in sparing what he should have destroyed. Each wrong choice distanced him from divine support, and what was once strength became weakness. The man who should have inspired confidence now carried fear in his eyes. The threats from the Philistines grew on the border, and the people felt that something fundamental had broken. It wasn't just a matter of military or political strategy, it was something deeper, almost spiritual. When a leader loses his way, everyone around him begins to falter as well. And there was Israel, vulnerable, trembling, desperately needing someone not only to lead, but someone they could trust. The question hung in the air like a heavy cloud. If God rejected Saul, who would lead the people now? Far from the palace where Saul trembled, far from the political tensions and rumors of war, there was a place where life followed its simple and honest rhythm. Bethlehem was a small town, known more for its rolling hills and verdant pastures than for any military or political grandeur. There, among sheep and open fields, lived a young man whom no one would imagine as a future king. His name was David, the youngest of 8 brothers, and his routine was as ordinary as that of any shepherd in the region. He woke early, guided the flock to where the grass was most abundant, watched each animal carefully, and returned at the end of the day covered in dust and exhaustion. There was no glamour in it, no spotlight, no applause. It was hard, solitary, repetitive work. But it was precisely there in that anonymity that something extraordinary was being forged. Caring for sheep requires patience. They are fragile, stubborn, and easily frightened. David learned to recognize each one by the sound of its bleating, to sense when something was wrong even before seeing it. He not only herded the flock, he protected, fed, healed wounds, and carried the weakest on his shoulders when they couldn't keep up. This daily care molded in him a rare sensitivity, an attention to detail that many leaders never develop. While his older brothers trained for war or attended to more important matters, David was learning to serve unseen, to lead without receiving credit, to protect without expecting recognition. And God observed it all. But the life of a shepherd was not all tranquility and contemplation. There was real danger lurking in the shadows. Bears and lions prowled the hills, always looking for easy prey, and an unprotected flock was an irresistible invitation. David faced these predators more than once, not because he was reckless or sought adventure, but because his responsibility demanded it. When a lion attacked and dragged off a sheep, David did not hesitate. He ran after the animal, grabbed it by the mane, and snatched the sheep from its jaws. When the bear charged, he did not retreat. He fought, struck, and won. These were not epic battles witnessed by crowds. They were silent confrontations, fought far from human eyes but right before the eyes of God. Each victory over a predator strengthened something within him, the certainty that when you trust in God and act with courage, the impossible becomes possible. There was something more about that young shepherd that set him apart. In moments of quiet, when the flock rested in the shade and the wind blew gently across the hills, David would take up his harp. He played melodies that sprang from his heart, songs that no one but the sheep and the stars could hear. They weren't memorized or rehearsed pieces meant to impress. They were spontaneous expressions of gratitude, praise, lament, and trust. David conversed with God through music, and those solitary hours became a personal sanctuary. He didn't know it, but he was composing psalms that would one day be sung by entire generations. He was cultivating an intimacy with the Creator, that would be his greatest strength in times of trial. While Saul lost his connection with God through disobedience, David deepened it through sincere devotion. No one in Bethlehem paid much attention to him. To his family, he was just the youngest, the boy who looked after the sheep while his brothers did more important things. To the city, he was invisible, just another young shepherd among many others. But God doesn't measure relevance the way humans do. While people looked at appearance, social standing, and physical strength, God looked at the heart. And David's heart was different, not because it was perfect or without flaws, but because it was sincere, dedicated, and willing to obey even when no one was watching. He wasn't there to be noticed. He was there because he believed that every task, no matter how small, had value in God's eyes. The hills of Bethlehem became his school of leadership. There he learned that protecting the weak is more important than impressing the strong. He learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but trust in God greater than fear. He learned that music can calm inner storms and that loneliness can be transformed into communion. He learned that faithfulness in small things prepares for responsibility in great things. All this happened far from the spotlight, far from human expectations, but right at the center of the divine plan. David was being prepared for something he himself did not imagine. Every sheep protected, every predator faced, every note played on the harp, every prayer whispered under the stars, all this was training. And the question that hung over that simple life was profound. Will a heart trained in secrecy be seen in public? The answer was about to arrive, brought by an elderly prophet who would ascend to Bethlehem carrying a horn of oil and a secret mission. The anonymous shepherd was about to discover that God never wastes years of preparation, and that those who are faithful in secret will be honored in the sight of all. But for now, David continued his routine, tending the sheep, playing his harp, trusting in God, unaware that his name was already written in the heart of the Most High as the next king of Israel. Samuel was old, but his steps still carried authority. When he arrived in Bethlehem, the whole city trembled. A prophet doesn't appear without reason, and his presence usually meant judgment or revelation. The elders came out to meet him with fear in their eyes, asking if he came in peace. Samuel reassured them, explaining that he had come to offer a sacrifice to the Lord, and asked Jesse and his sons to consecrate themselves to participate in the ceremony. No one suspected the true purpose of that visit. God had sent Samuel on a secret mission, to anoint the next king of Israel, someone from the house of Jesse. But not even Samuel knew exactly who it would be. When Jesse presented his sons, Samuel first saw Eliab, the eldest. Tall, strong, with the bearing of a warrior, everything about him screamed leadership. Samuel looked and thought, surely this is the one chosen by the Lord. It made sense. Eliab had the looks, the age, the position. But God interrupted the prophet's thoughts with words that would forever change how choices are made. Do not look at his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not see as man sees. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. That phrase echoed in Samuel's soul. God was establishing a completely different standard. It wasn't about physical strength, outward charisma, or immediate impression. It was about the inner self, about that which no one sees, but which determines everything. Jesse summoned Abinadab. Samuel watched, awaiting divine confirmation, but it did not come. Then came Shammah, then another, and another, until 7 sons had passed before the prophet. All were capable men, each with their own qualities, but none of them was God's chosen one. Samuel was confused. God had clearly stated that the king was among Jesse's sons, but none of those present had been approved. Then he asked the question that would change everything. Are these all your sons? Jesse hesitated as if the answer were too obvious to warrant attention. There is still the youngest, but he is tending the sheep. The answer carried a tone of insignificance, as if to say, it can't be him, he's just a boy. But Samuel insisted, send for him, for we will not sit down to eat until he arrives. There was urgency in those words, a prophetic certainty that the missing piece was precisely where no one was looking. So David was summoned. He arrived from the field, still smelling of sheep, his skin tanned by the sun, his eyes shining, and his heart pure. The Bible describes him as ruddy, handsome, and with a good presence, but that wasn't what convinced God. It was his heart. When David entered, the Lord said to Samuel, "Rise and anoint him, this is the one." Samuel took the horn of oil and, in front of his brothers, poured the oil on David's head. It wasn't a public ceremony with trumpets and crowds. It was an intimate, almost secret moment, witnessed only by the family. But what happened there transcended the visible. The Bible says that from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came upon David. Something changed in him, not externally, but internally. He continued being a shepherd, continued caring for the sheep, continued living his simple routine, but now he carried within him a real anointing, a divine calling, an invisible mark that set him apart for a greater purpose. No one in Israel knew. No one outside that house suspected that the next king had been chosen. Saul still occupied the throne, still commanded armies, still was recognized as an authority. But God had already turned the page, the anointing had changed hands, and David, anointed in Bethlehem, remained unknown in Israel. This is the beauty and mystery of God's timing. He doesn't need public approval to validate his choices. He doesn't wait for the world to recognize him before acting. He anoints in secret, prepares in hidden places, and reveals at the right time. David returned to the hills, to the sheep, to the harp. But now it was different. Now he knew that God had chosen him, and this certainty would be his anchor in the difficult days to come. While David returned to the fields of Bethlehem carrying the secret anointing, Saul sank into torment. The Bible says that the Spirit of the Lord departed from him, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. It wasn't just melancholy or political stress. It was a deep spiritual oppression that left him agitated, distressed, unable to find peace. The king's servants noticed and suggested a solution: to bring someone who knew how to play the harp so that the music would calm the king in times of crisis. Someone mentioned a young man from Bethlehem, the son of Jesse, who played well and was brave, prudent in speech, and handsome, and the Lord was with him. Thus unknowingly Saul sent for the very one whom God had anointed to replace him. David entered the palace for the first time. It must have been overwhelming for a young shepherd accustomed to hills and silence. There was the center of power, the place where national decisions were made, where warriors gathered, where the king dwelt. But David was not called to fight or advise. He was called to play, and he played. When his hands glided across the harp strings, something happened. The music he had learned in the lonely hills, those melodies born of communion with God, had the power to calm demons. Saul felt relief. The torment receded. Peace returned temporarily. David became part of the palace routine, playing whenever the king needed him, serving with the same faithfulness with which he served the sheep. But while the harp brought peace within the palace, rumors of war reached from outside. The Philistines were on the move again. They were Israel's constant enemy, a warlike and well-armed people who controlled iron technology and constantly pressed against the borders. News arrived of troops gathering, camps being set up, preparations for invasion. Tension grew. Saul knew that soon he would have to gather his army and march into confrontation. David's music could soothe the king's soul, but it could not silence the roar of the approaching enemy. There was something profoundly ironic about that scene. There was the king, rejected by God, tormented and frail, being comforted by the young man God had chosen to take his place. There was David, anointed but unknown, humbly serving the one he would one day replace. And there were the seeds of the conflict that would define the destiny of Israel. The peace of the palace was fragile, temporary, sustained by harp strings. But outside in the valley of Elah, a giant was about to emerge, and music would need to give way to courage. David didn't know it yet, but those hands that calmed Saul with melody would soon wield a sling and change the history of an entire nation. The valley of Elah was a strategic location, a strip of land that snaked between rocky hills and opened up like a natural corridor between Philistine and Israelite territories. Whoever controlled that valley would control access to the inland cities, to trade routes, and to the survival of both peoples. Therefore, when the Philistines decided to advance, it was there that they set up camp, and Israel, forced to respond, positioned its troops on the opposite side. Two nations facing each other, separated only by a narrow valley and the suffocating tension that filled the air. On the Philistine side, there was organization, confidence, even a certain arrogance. They had better armor, iron weapons, forged with technology that Israel did not possess, and a solid military tradition. Their soldiers moved with the confidence of those who had already won many battles. They pitched tents, lit fires, sharpened swords, and waited. There was no hurry. They knew that time was on their side, because the more Israel hesitated, the more fear would grow. And fear is a weapon as powerful as any blade. On the Israelite side, the atmosphere was completely different. There were soldiers, yes, men summoned from their cities and tribes, armed with what they had, ready to defend the land. But something essential was missing: confidence. Saul was there, the king who should have inspired courage, but he himself carried the weight of divine rejection. His commanders looked at the Philistine army and saw superiority. His soldiers looked at their own weapons and felt inadequate. It wasn't just a matter of numbers or equipment, it was something deeper, something spiritual. When you lose the certainty that God is with you, even the smallest enemy seems gigantic. The two armies faced each other day after day, but neither attacked. It was a classic military stalemate. Neither side wanted to risk an open battle that could result in a massacre. The valley between them became a no-man's land, an empty space filled only with tension and silence. Soldiers woke up, donned their armor, wielded spears, and stood there, waiting. Waiting for what? No one knew for sure. Perhaps a sign, perhaps courage, perhaps a miracle. But the days passed, and nothing changed. The stalemate dragged on, and with it grew frustration, weariness, and fear. There was something profoundly unsettling about that situation. War is terrible, but at least it involves movement, decisions, and resolution. This stalemate was worse. It was the agony of waiting, the torture of uncertainty, the weight of knowing that something terrible was about to happen, but not knowing when or how. The Israelite soldiers looked across the valley and saw a confident, well-equipped, seemingly invincible army. And they began to question, why are we here? How are we going to win this? Is God still with us? The silence of the Israelite people was deafening. There were no war chants, no cries of defiance, no contagious excitement of an army that believes in victory. There was only the low murmur of frightened men, the creaking of armor as they nervously adjusted, the sound of restless footsteps. It was the silence of those who expect the worst. And on the other side, the Philistines perceived this. They sensed Israel's fear as an animal senses the weakness of its prey, and they decided to exploit this in the cruelest way possible. They sent a champion. The strategy was ancient but effective. Instead of risking a full-scale confrontation that could cost many lives on both sides, the Philistines proposed single combat. One man against one man. The winner would bring victory to his people, and the loser would submit. It was a high-stakes gamble, but also a demonstration of absolute confidence, because the Philistines had someone they considered unbeatable. And when that someone first appeared on the front lines, Israel's fear turned to pure terror. The silence of the people contrasted violently with the champion's voice, which was about to echo through the valley. And that voice would change everything. He came out every morning and every afternoon, always at the same time, like a macabre ritual, as if he wanted to imprint his presence on the mind of every Israelite soldier. And it worked. Goliath of Gath wasn't just big. He was a nightmarish vision. The Bible records that he measured 6 cubits and a span, approximately 3 meters tall. To give you an idea, that means he was almost twice the height of an average man. When he walked, the ground seemed to tremble. When he spoke, his voice echoed through the valley like thunder. But it wasn't just the size that was terrifying. It was the armor. Goliath wore a bronze helmet that gleamed in the sun, completely protecting his head. He wore a bronze-scale breastplate that weighed about 57 kilograms, more than many Israelite soldiers could carry, let alone wear and fight. His legs were protected by bronze greaves, and between his shoulders he carried a bronze javelin. The shaft of his spear was like a loom cylinder, thick and heavy, and the iron point weighed about 7 kilograms. Just the tip of the spear. Ahead of him walked a shield bearer, carrying a huge shield that covered the giant as he advanced. Goliath was not just a large soldier. He was a walking war machine, a human tank, the physical embodiment of Philistine military might. Everything about him screamed invincibility, and he knew it. When he stood on the front line and looked at the army of Israel across the valley, he saw exactly what he expected to see: fear. Then he shouted. His voice echoed across the valley, reaching the ears of every Israelite soldier, penetrating to their very soul. "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you servants of Saul? Choose a man to come down to me. If he can fight me and kill me, we will be your slaves. But if I prevail against him and kill him, you will be our slaves and serve us." And then came the most painful part, the affront that cut deeper than any sword. "Today, I defy the armies of Israel. Send me a man so that we may fight." It was a calculated insult, a public humiliation. Goliath wasn't just challenging Israel militarily, he was mocking their courage, questioning their honor, ridiculing their faith. And he did this twice a day. 40 days, 80 appearances. 80 times he would come out, shout his challenge, and no one would answer. 80 times, Israel's silence confirmed what Goliath already knew. They were paralyzed by fear. Saul listened to those words and felt the weight of helplessness. He was the king, the leader, the one who should set the example. But he was also afraid. His soldiers looked at Goliath and saw certain death. None of them volunteered. None of them dared to take a step forward. Because humanly speaking, it was suicide. Goliath had everything: size, strength, armor, experience, confidence. What could an ordinary Israelite soldier do against that? But there was something Goliath didn't know. There was something that even Israel didn't yet realize. That challenge wasn't just military. It was spiritual. When Goliath shouted, "I challenge the troops of Israel," he was unknowingly challenging the very God of Israel. And God doesn't leave challenges like that unanswered. He simply waited for the right moment and the right person. Someone who didn't trust in armor but in name. Someone who didn't measure the enemy by size but by divine perspective. Someone who had already faced bears and lions and learned that when God is with you, the size of the enemy doesn't matter. Goliath continued shouting day after day, unaware that his voice was about to be silenced by a smooth stone and unwavering faith. The question echoed through the valley, laden with scorn and defiance. Who will dare answer the man in the middle? The answer was on its way, and it came from Bethlehem, carrying bread and cheese. David was back in the hills of Bethlehem, tending the sheep as he always had. His time in the palace playing the harp for Saul had been a remarkable experience, but now he was home, in the familiar routine, far from the political tensions and rumors of war. Or at least, that's what it seemed. Because while David was peacefully tending his flock, his 3 older brothers, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah, were in the valley of Elah, part of Saul's army, facing the terrifying standoff with the Philistines. Jesse, their father, was worried. He hadn't heard from his sons in weeks, and a father's anxiety is something that doesn't calm easily. Then Jesse called David. The mission was simple, almost trivial, to take provisions to his brothers and check on their well-being. Jesse carefully prepared what would be sent: an ephah of roasted grain and 10 loaves of bread for his brothers, and 10 cheeses for the commander of 1,000 under whom they served. It was a gesture of paternal care, but also of respect and gratitude to the leader who commanded his sons. Jesse instructed David to deliver everything, check on his brothers, and bring back some assurance that they were well, perhaps a piece of clothing, something that would confirm they were alive and healthy. David obeyed immediately. He didn't question, he didn't hesitate. He got up at dawn, left the sheep in the care of another shepherd, took the provisions, and went. It was a common task, the kind of thing any son would do. Bringing food to his brothers. Nothing epic, nothing glorious, just simple obedience to a father's request. But God has a peculiar way of using the ordinary to unleash the extraordinary. That trip with bread and cheese was about to change the history of Israel. David walked to the camp, arriving just as the army was leaving to take up positions on the battle line. The timing couldn't have been more perfect or more providential. He left the provisions with the baggage handler and ran to the front line to find his brothers. He wanted to see them, hug them, know how they were. But when he got there, something completely unexpected happened. He heard a voice. Goliath broke through the Philistine lines, as he had done twice a day for 40 days, and shouted his usual challenge, the same arrogant words, the same tone of contempt, the same mockery. For the Israelite soldiers, it was just another repetition of the daily nightmare. They were already numb with fear, accustomed to humiliation, resigned to their powerlessness. But for David, who was hearing it for the first time, the impact was completely different. He didn't just hear an enemy soldier challenging Israel. He heard someone defying the living God. David had gone to the camp to deliver bread and cheese, but God had led him there to deliver deliverance. That simple mission, that domestic task, that paternal message, all of this was merely the means by which divine providence placed the right person in the right place at the right time. Jesse thought he was sending his son to deliver food. God knew he was sending the future king to confront a giant. A delivery visit was about to become an irreversible destiny. When Goliath shouted, the Israelite soldiers retreated. It was the automatic reflex of 40 days of terror. They saw that giant covered in bronze, heard that thundering voice, and everything inside them screamed, "Run!" And that's exactly what they did. They retreated, lowered their eyes, murmured amongst themselves about the impossibility of the situation. The fear had become so familiar that no one questioned it anymore. It was simply reality. Goliath was invincible, and Israel was condemned to humiliation. But David did not back down. He stood there, looking at the giant, listening to the words, and something inside him began to boil. It was not impulsive anger or youthful bravado. It was theological indignation, a deep zeal for the honor of God. David turned to the men around him and asked a question that no one else was asking. What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this reproach from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? The question was laden with meaning. David didn't ask, "Who is strong enough to defeat Goliath?" He asked, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine?" The word uncircumcised wasn't just a physical description. It was a theological statement. It meant that Goliath was outside the covenant with God, that he had no relationship with the Most High, that he was merely an ordinary man defying the eternal God. And that, to David, was intolerable. How could someone without God dare to mock God's people? How could a mortal dare to challenge the Creator of the universe? The soldiers around began to respond. They told of the reward Saul had promised: great riches, the king's daughter in marriage, and tax exemption for the family of the man who killed Goliath. It was a generous offer, the kind of thing that could completely change someone's life. But while they spoke of gold and privileges, David remained focused on something else. For him, it wasn't about reward. It was about honor. God's honor was being trampled upon, and no one seemed to care. David repeated the question to others, as if he couldn't believe that no one was doing anything. And the more he asked, the more his indignation grew. He saw trained soldiers, men of war, experienced warriors, all paralyzed by fear. He saw an entire army immobilized by a single man, and he couldn't understand how this was possible. Not because he was naive or didn't recognize the danger, but because he saw the situation from a completely different perspective. While the soldiers looked at Goliath and saw a 3-meter-tall giant in bronze armor, David looked and saw a mortal man defying the immortal God. While they measured the height of the enemy, David measured the greatness of God. While they calculated the chances of victory based on physical strength, David calculated based on divine faithfulness. The difference was not in the eyes, but in the heart. And that heart that God had chosen in Bethlehem, that heart that had been anointed in secret, that heart that had learned to trust in God in the lonely hills, that heart now burned with an uncontainable zeal. For the soldiers, it was just another day of war, another inevitable humiliation, another demonstration that Israel was at a disadvantage. But for David, it was an unacceptable affront to the name of the Lord. And he was about to do something about it, because for him it wasn't just war, it was an honor. The honor of God, who had anointed him, protected him, sustained him, and who had never failed him. And that honor was worth more than life itself. Eliab heard his younger brother's voice even before he saw him. That voice asking questions, challenging, stirring up the surrounding soldiers. When he finally located David in the crowd, Eliab's irritation exploded. He approached with heavy steps, his face red with anger, and uttered words that cut deeper than any blade. "Why did you come down here? With whom did you leave those few sheep in the desert? I know your arrogance and the wickedness of your heart. You came down only to watch the battle." It was a brutal and completely unjust attack. Eliab wasn't just reprimanding David for being there. He was attacking his character, his intentions, his worth. He called the flock a few sheep, as if David's work were insignificant. He accused him of presumption and wickedness, as if he knew his brother's innermost thoughts. And he reduced his presence to mere morbid curiosity, as if David were just an irresponsible boy wanting to see blood and violence. But why so much hostility? What provoked such a disproportionate reaction? Perhaps Eliab was ashamed. He was the oldest, the strongest, the one who should have been leading. And there he was, along with the entire army of Israel, paralyzed by fear for 40 days. Then his younger brother, the shepherd, arrives and begins to ask questions that expose everyone's cowardice, questions that no one else dared to ask, questions that revealed that something was deeply wrong, and that bothered them. It bothered them a lot. There was also perhaps an older resentment. Eliab was the firstborn, the one Samuel saw first when he went to anoint the next king. He had the looks, the stature, everything that seemed to qualify someone for leadership. But God rejected him and chose David. Eliab was present that day. He saw the oil being poured on his younger brother's head. He saw the divine choice that made no sense in human eyes. And perhaps since then, he carried a wound that never fully healed. Seeing David there, asking courageous questions while he himself hid in fear, must have touched that wound with unbearable force. But David did not retaliate angrily. His response was calm, almost disconcerting in its simplicity. "What have I done now? Wasn't it just a word?" He did not defend himself against the accusations. He did not engage in Eliab's game. He did not allow himself to be distracted from the focus. Because for David, this was not about wounded pride or family disputes. It was about something infinitely greater. It was about an affront to the living God. And he would not allow the contempt of a brother to prevent him from doing what was right. David simply walked away from Eliab and continued asking his questions to other people. Family rejection did not silence him. Disdain did not paralyze him. He had learned in the lonely hills of Bethlehem that God's approval is worth more than the approval of men. He had learned that obeying God sometimes means being misunderstood even by one's own family, and he was willing to pay that price. David's words began to spread through the camp. Soldiers talked about the young shepherd, who was asking bold questions, questioning why no one faced Goliath, speaking about the honor of God with a conviction that hadn't been heard there in a long time. Eventually, these words reached Saul's ears, and the king summoned David. The boy despised by his older brother was about to be heard by the king. Because God has a way of exalting those whom the world despises and of giving voice to those silenced by men. David entered Saul's tent. It was the second time he had stood before the king, but this time the context was completely different. Before, he had been summoned to play the harp and soothe the king's anxieties. Now he was there as someone who had something to say about the national crisis. Saul looked at him, a young, red-haired, healthy-looking man without armor, without battle scars, without anything to indicate military experience. And David said something that must have sounded absurd to the king's ears. "Let no one lose courage because of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight against him." Saul responded exactly as any rational person would. "You cannot go against this Philistine to fight him. You are only a youth, and he has been a warrior since his youth." It was the voice of logic, experience, and common sense. Goliath had decades of military training, had fought in countless battles, and had survived innumerable confrontations. David was a teenage shepherd. The difference was obvious, glaring, undeniable. But David was not relying on human logic. He was relying on something much greater. And then David began to tell his story, not with arrogance, not with bravado, but with the simplicity of one who recounts facts. "Your servant has been tending his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it, struck it down, and rescued the lamb from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its mane, struck it down, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear." Those words must have echoed in the tent with unexpected weight. David wasn't making up stories to impress. He was sharing real experiences, confrontations that no one but him and God had witnessed. In the lonely hills of Bethlehem, far from human eyes, David had faced deadly predators, and he had won. Not because he was stronger than a lion or faster than a bear, but because God was with him. Each victory in secret had been a lesson in faith, a divine training, a preparation for something greater. Then David made the connection that no one else was making. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. To David, Goliath was no different from a lion or a bear. He was just another threat against what God had entrusted to him. Before it was sheep, now it was God's people. Before the enemy had 4 legs, now it had 2. But the principle was the same. When you are doing God's will, He fights for you. And then came the declaration that would define everything. The confession of faith that legitimized David, not by his own strength, but by divine dependence. "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." It was not presumption, it was testimony. David was not saying, "I am capable." He was saying, "God is faithful." He was not trusting in himself. He was trusting in the one who had never failed. Saul was silent for a moment. He looked at the young man, heard that unwavering faith, and something within him gave way. Perhaps he remembered when he himself was young and God was with him. Perhaps he recognized that what David had, that confidence, that certainty, was exactly what he had lost. Perhaps he realized that in the absence of any other option, the faith of that young shepherd was Israel's only hope. Saul replied, "Go, and may the Lord be with you." Permission granted. But then, perhaps moved by a last vestige of royal responsibility, Saul tried to equip David. He dressed him in his own armor, placed a bronze helmet on his head, and covered him with a breastplate. David tried to walk, but he couldn't. He wasn't used to it. It wasn't his. And he said to Saul, "I cannot walk with this, for I am not used to it." And he took it all off. The royal armor would not fit. I saw he would fight the way God had trained him, with faith, with a sling, and in the name of the Lord. Saul looked at David and saw an unarmed young man, unprotected, with nothing to defend him from the giant who had been terrorizing Israel for 40 days. The king knew he was sending this boy into a deadly confrontation, and something within him, perhaps a last glimmer of responsibility, perhaps guilt, perhaps just paternal instinct, led him to try to protect him in the only way he knew how. Saul ordered his own armor to be brought. It wasn't just any armor, it was royal armor, forged from the finest bronze available, fitted to the body of a king, used in battles, tested in combat. If David was going to fight, at least let him fight with the best protection Israel could offer. The servants brought the pieces one by one. First the tunic, heavy and reinforced, then the bronze breastplate, which covered his chest and back, designed to deflect spears and arrows. Next the helmet, also of bronze, which protected his head and part of his face. And finally a sword, fastened to his belt, the traditional weapon of any warrior. Saul dressed David with his own hands, adjusting each piece, making sure everything was in place. It was a generous, almost moving gesture. The king was giving the young shepherd the best he had. But when David tried to move, something was profoundly wrong. The armor was too heavy. Not just physically, although the weight was considerable for someone unaccustomed to it. It was heavy in another way, more subtle, deeper. David took a few unsteady steps inside the tent. He tried to raise his arm, but the movement was limited, awkward. He tried to turn his body, but the breastplate restricted his movements. He picked up his sword and gripped it, but the weapon felt strange in his hands, as if it belonged to someone else. Because in fact, it did. David stopped. He took a deep breath, and then he said something that must have sounded almost offensive, though that wasn't the intention. "I can't walk with this, for I'm not used to it." It was a simple, honest statement, but full of meaning. David wasn't rejecting Saul's generosity out of pride or stubbornness. He was acknowledging a fundamental truth. You can't fight God's battle in someone else's armor. You can't fulfill your calling by imitating someone else's method. You need to be authentic. You need to be who God made you to be. Then David began to remove the pieces one by one. First the helmet, then the breastplate, then the tunic, then the sword. Each piece removed was an act of silent courage, an affirmation of identity, a refusal to conform to human expectations. When he finished, he was back to what he had always been, a young shepherd without armor, without a sword, without anything the world considered necessary for victory. But he had something that no armor could give, the certainty of who he was and who God was. There was something profoundly symbolic in that moment. Saul had lost God's favor by trying to be what he wasn't, making choices that contradicted his calling, acting out of fear instead of faith. And there he was, trying to clothe David in his own armor, as if success came from external equipment. But David understood something Saul had forgotten. God doesn't need armor to give victory. He needs obedience, faith, and hearts willing to trust him completely. David left the king's tent exactly as he had entered, simple, unarmed, vulnerable in human eyes. But he was not naked. He was clothed with something invisible and infinitely more powerful. The anointing of God, the experience of past victories, the certainty that the Lord of hosts fought for him, without a sword, without armor, only with what God had already trained him with, and that would be more than enough. The soldiers who saw him leave must have thought he was crazy. Some probably shook their heads in pity, imagining they were about to witness the death of a brave but foolish young man. Others may have felt a flash of admiration mixed with disbelief. But David wasn't concerned with what they thought. He had learned in the lonely hills of Bethlehem that God's opinion is worth more than the opinion of crowds. And God had already spoken, through every defeated lion, every vanquished bear, every protected sheep. Now it was simply a matter of applying the same lessons on a larger scale. David walked toward the valley, carrying only his shepherd's staff and his sling. In the eyes of the world he was going to his death, but in the eyes of God he was going to his destiny. And the difference between these two perspectives was everything. David went down toward the valley, and along the way there was a stream. The water ran clear and fresh, winding between the stones that time and the current had polished. He stopped there, not out of hesitation or fear, but out of preparation. Because even the most unwavering faith needs instruments, and God often uses the natural to accomplish the supernatural. David knelt by the bank of the stream and began to choose stones. These weren't just any stones. He examined them carefully one by one, feeling their weight, texture, and shape. They needed to be smooth so they would fly straight when launched from the sling. They needed to be the right size, neither too big to be heavy nor too small to lose impact. They needed to fit perfectly in the leather pouch of the sling, that simple instrument he had used so many times to protect the sheep from predators. David knew stones, he knew slings, he knew trajectories, speeds, and points of impact. This wasn't improvisation, it was expertise acquired through years of silent practice. He chose 5 stones. 5, not 1, relying on a single perfect shot. Not 10, carrying unnecessary excess. 5, the exact number that his experience and instinct told him was sufficient. Some biblical commentators suggest that David chose 5 because Goliath had 4 brothers, and he was prepared to face them all if necessary. Others say that 5 was simply the standard number an experienced slinger carried, but perhaps the deeper reason was another. Each stone was an act of trust. Not trust in the stone itself, but trust that God would use what David offered. He placed the 5 smooth stones in his shepherd's bag. Then he took his staff, the same staff he had used to guide sheep, to ward off predators, to support himself on long walks through the hills. It was a simple object worn from use, nothing impressive about it, but it was his. It was authentic. It was part of who he was, and he would take it into battle not as a weapon, but as a symbol that he was not ceasing to be who he was to face Goliath. He was being exactly who God had made him to be. David stood there for a moment by the bank of the stream before continuing on. We don't know if he prayed aloud or silently, but it's impossible to imagine that he didn't pray. Everything in his life up to that point had been marked by communion with God. The songs in the hills, the confidence in confrontations with predators, the response to Samuel's call, everything flowed from a deep relationship with the Creator. And now, facing the most decisive moment of his life so far, it's certain that he sought God's presence. Perhaps you whispered words that would later become psalms. Perhaps you simply took a deep breath and felt the peace that comes from knowing you are at the center of God's will. Perhaps you recalled past victories, not to boast, but to strengthen your faith. You delivered me from the lion. You delivered me from the bear. You will deliver me from this Philistine. Each stone in the bag was a declaration of faith. Each step toward the giant was an act of obedience. Each heartbeat was a silent prayer. The stream continued to flow, indifferent to the drama that was about to unfold. The stones were still there, thousands of them, polished by the water, waiting for centuries. But 5 of them had been chosen. 5 of them would be part of history. 5 of them would be remembered for millennia, not because they were special in themselves, but because they were placed in the right hands, at the right time, by someone who trusted in the right God. David stood up. He adjusted his bag on his shoulder. He gripped his sling. He looked across the valley where Goliath waited, confident and mocking, and he began to walk. He didn't run. He didn't hesitate. He simply walked, with the firmness of one who knows he is not alone. Each stone an act of trust, each step an act of faith, each breath a prayer, and God, who sees the heart, smiled. David began walking toward the center of the valley. Each step took him further from the safety of the Israelite army and closer to the giant who had terrorized an entire nation for 40 days. The silence that fell over both armies was absolute, heavy, almost suffocating. Thousands of men watched, hardly able to believe what they were seeing. A young shepherd without armor, without a sword, walking alone toward Goliath of Gath. To many it seemed the tragic end of a brave but naive boy. To others, it was a moment of unbearable suspense. But for David, it was simply obedience. On the other side, Goliath also began to advance. His squire went ahead, carrying that enormous shield that protected the giant as he marched. The ground seemed to tremble under the weight of his steps. The bronze armor reflected the sunlight, creating an intimidating gleam. The spear in his hand was like a weaver's cylinder, thick and deadly. Everything about him screamed power, experience, invincibility. He had accepted dozens of challenges throughout his military career and overcome them all. This would be just one more. But when Goliath got close enough to see clearly who was coming toward him, he stopped and looked and couldn't believe it. It wasn't an experienced warrior. It wasn't a champion of Israel. It was a boy, a healthy-looking, red-haired youth carrying a shepherd's staff and a sling. No armor, no sword, nothing to indicate that this was a serious confrontation. Goliath felt something he didn't expect to feel: insult, anger, deep contempt. He looked at David and shouted, "Am I a dog that you come against me with sticks?" The voice echoed through the valley, heavy with indignation and mockery. Goliath was genuinely offended. He was a legendary warrior, a feared champion, someone who had defeated the best soldiers of enemy armies. And Israel was sending a teenage shepherd? It was an unbearable affront. Then he cursed David by his gods, invoking the names of the Philistine deities, calling down curses on that audacious young man. And he made a grim promise. "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field." It was a brutal threat, designed to terrify, to make the opponent retreat, to break any remaining courage. And it would have worked on anyone who was relying on their own strength. But David wasn't. He heard Goliath's words, he heard the curses, he heard the threats, and he didn't tremble. Because he wasn't there in his own name. He wasn't relying on his own strength. He wasn't fighting for personal glory. He was there as a representative of the living God. And that changed everything. David answered, "David." And his words cut through the air with a clarity and authority that no one expected from someone so young. "You come against me with sword, spear, and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." It was a stark theological contrast. Goliath came with physical weapons: sword, spear, javelin, armor, brute force. David came with a name, the name of the Lord of hosts, the God who commands the heavenly hosts, the creator of the universe, the one before whom all creation bows. Goliath trusted in what he could see and touch. David trusted in the invisible and eternal. Goliath measured victory by size and equipment. David measured victory by divine faithfulness. Then David made a prophetic declaration, a proclamation that would echo through the centuries. "This very day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." It wasn't arrogance, it was prophecy. David wasn't boasting of his own abilities, he was declaring what God would do. He wasn't striving to prove something about himself, he was striving to reveal something about God. And the purpose was clear, that all the earth would know that there is a God in Israel. That all would see that the Lord doesn't need swords or spears to save, that it would be recorded forever that war belongs to the Lord, and he gives victory how, when, and through whom he chooses. Goliath heard those words and must have felt something strange, perhaps a flicker of doubt, perhaps a pang of fear, or perhaps just more anger. He began to advance, determined to crush that insolent young man and silence that audacious voice, but David did not retreat. He also advanced, running toward the giant, closing the distance quickly. Because faith is not passivity. Faith acts. Faith moves. Faith runs toward the impossible, trusting that God will make it possible. There, in the space between two armies, two names clashed. Not just David and Goliath, but the name of the Lord of hosts against the gods of the Philistines. Faith against might. The invisible against the visible. And the question that hung over that valley, over that moment, over that story, was profound and eternal. Sword against name. Who sustains the world? The answer was about to be given unequivocally. The world seemed to slow down, thousands of eyes fixed on two men in the center of a valley. The silence was so profound that it was possible to hear the wind blowing gently through the hills, the distant sound of a bird, the heavy breathing of soldiers holding their breath. Goliath advanced with heavy, confident steps, his spear raised, ready to pierce through the audacious young man. David ran towards him, agile, quick, determined. The distance between them decreased with each passing second. David reached into his shepherd's bag. His fingers found one of the 5 smooth stones he had carefully selected from the stream. It wasn't a conscious, deliberate choice. It was instinct, muscle memory, the result of years of practicing with the sling in the hills of Bethlehem. He picked up the stone, placed it in the leather strap of the sling, and in one fluid motion began to swing. The sling whistled through the air, once, twice, 3 times. The circular motion gained speed, accumulated centrifugal force, transformed a simple stone into a lethal projectile. David knew that sound. He knew the weight, the tension, the exact moment to release it. He had done it hundreds, perhaps thousands of times, against stationary targets, against moving predators, in windy, rainy, and dark conditions. His precision had been forged in years of solitary practice, when no one but God was watching. Goliath continued advancing, perhaps not even taking the sling seriously. After all, he had a bronze helmet protecting his head. He had armor covering his entire body. What could a stone do against all that? But there was a vulnerable point. A single point where the bronze didn't cover. His forehead. The space between the helmet and the rest of the armor. A small area, difficult to hit, especially with a moving target. But David wasn't aiming alone. His hands were guided by years of experience, his eyes were focused, and God, who had promised victory, was in control. David let go. The stone flew. It cut through the air with impressive speed, a perfect, straight, precise trajectory. The sound was almost imperceptible, just the brief whistle of something small moving very fast. But the impact was unmistakable. The stone struck Goliath right in the forehead, the only unprotected spot, with enough force to penetrate his skull. The sound of the impact echoed through the valley, a dry, definitive, deadly blow. Goliath stopped. For a moment, he stood there as if nothing had happened, as if that 3-meter-tall giant covered in bronze were truly invincible. But then his knees began to buckle. His eyes lost focus. The spear slipped from his hand, and slowly, like a tower being toppled, like a mountain collapsing. Goliath fell, forward, face down on the ground. The impact of his body hitting the earth was so strong, it seemed to make the entire valley tremble. The Colossus touched the ground. The invincible was vanquished. The giant who had terrorized Israel for 40 days lay fallen motionless, defeated by a stone and a young shepherd. But the battle was not over. Not yet. Because Goliath needed not only to fall, but to be completely defeated. There needed to be a visible, undeniable sign, one that everyone could see and that no one could question. David ran, not in flight, but toward the fallen giant. He had no sword of his own, but Goliath did. David stopped beside the immense body, pulled the giant's sword from its sheath, a huge, heavy weapon designed for hands much larger than his, and with effort raised it. Then, before both armies, before Israel and the Philistines, before heaven and earth, David used Goliath's own sword to behead him, the head separated from the body, and with it all the arrogance, all the mockery, all the terror that man had represented. David picked up the head, that grotesque but necessary trophy, and raised it for all to see, not out of cruelty, but as a testimony, so that it would be clear, unequivocal, permanent. The giant was dead. The God of Israel had given the victory. The impossible had become possible, and all this through a young man no one expected, using a weapon no one respected, trusting in a God who never fails. The silence that had dominated the valley exploded into clamor. From the Israelite side, shouts of victory, disbelief, and jubilation. From the Philistine side, cries of terror, despair, and flight. The battle, which had been decided by a single confrontation, was now turning into a chase. But all this began with a stone, a sling, and a heart that trusted in the name of the Lord of hosts. Goliath was down, but David knew that the victory needed to be complete, visible, undeniable. A stone to the forehead could be questioned. Someone might say it was luck, that the giant stumbled, that there was some accident. But there would be no doubt if the enemy's own weapon was used against him. There would be no questioning if the Philistine champion's head was severed from his body before thousands of witnesses. David wasn't being cruel, he was being strategic. He was ending not just a life, but a symbol. He was destroying not just a man, but the fear he represented. David ran toward the fallen body. The giant lay face down, motionless, the stone still embedded in his forehead, blood dripping onto the polished bronze of his helmet. It was a surreal sight. That colossus that had terrorized Israel for 40 days was now prostrate on the ground, defeated by someone a third of his size. David stopped beside him, panting, his heart racing from the run and the adrenaline of the confrontation. He looked at the immense body, at the armor gleaming in the sun, at the spear lying beside him, and then he saw the sword. It was a magnificent weapon, forged with Philistine mastery, designed for Goliath's enormous hands. The blade was long, heavy, sharp, capable of cutting through armor and shields. The hilt was thick, reinforced, made to withstand the power of devastating blows. David had no sword of his own. He had refused Saul's because he wasn't used to it. But now, before him, was the perfect weapon to complete what he had begun. And there was a poetic irony, a divine justice in using the enemy's own sword to seal his defeat. David knelt beside Goliath, unbuckled the belt that held the scabbard, and drew his sword. It was heavy, much heavier than any weapon he had ever held. His hands, accustomed to the shepherd's staff and the sling, now wielded a war sword. He raised it with effort, positioned himself, and with all the strength he could muster, struck. Once, twice, as many times as necessary. The blade cut through flesh, muscle, bone, and then the head separated from the body. David picked it up. That enormous head, still with its bronze helmet, its lifeless eyes, the mouth that had uttered so many taunts, now silenced forever. He raised it high so that all could see. On the Israelite side, on the Philistine side, there was no denying it. The champion was dead. The giant had fallen. The impossible had happened. And the weapon that had been used to terrorize had now become the instrument of its own destruction. There was something profoundly symbolic in that act. Goliath had trusted in his sword, in his spear, in his armor. He had mocked David for coming with sticks. He had cursed the young shepherd by his gods, but in the end it was his own sword that sealed his fate. It was his own reliance on physical weapons that proved futile. Because when you fight against the living God, your weapons become useless. When you defy the Lord of hosts, your strength becomes weakness. When you mock God's anointed, you sign your own death warrant. David held Goliath's head, and what he held was not merely a war trophy. It was a theological statement. It was visible proof that God fulfills his promises. It was confirmation that the Lord saves, not with sword or spear, but as he chooses. It was testimony that victory belongs to the Lord, and he grants it to those who trust in him, regardless of size, age, or military experience. Goliath's blood stained the ground of the valley of Elah. His sword, now in David's hands, still dripped. His armor, which had seemed impenetrable, had failed to protect his only vulnerable point, and his head, severed from his body, was a sign that no one could ignore. When the head falls, so does the fear. The terror that had paralyzed Israel for 40 days evaporated in an instant, and in its place something that had been forgotten began to resurface: courage. The shout began low, almost incredulous, as if the Israelite soldiers couldn't process what they had just witnessed. But then it gained strength, volume, intensity. It was a collective roar, an explosion of jubilation, of relief, of renewed faith. Goliath was dead. The giant had fallen. The young shepherd had done what no experienced warrior had dared to do, and if God had given victory over Goliath, then he would give victory over the Philistines. On the other side of the valley, the reaction was the opposite. The Philistines looked at the decapitated body of their champion and felt the terror that Israel had felt for 40 days. Their invincible champion had been defeated. Their giant had been felled by a boy. Their confidence evaporated instantly, replaced by pure panic. And they did the only thing that seemed to make sense at that moment. They fled. It wasn't an organized retreat. It was a chaotic, desperate stampede. Soldiers dropped spears, shields, anything that would slow them down. Officers shouted orders that no one heard. The military formation dissolved in seconds, transforming into a terrified crowd running for their lives. They ran towards Gath, towards Ekron, towards anywhere that offered safety. But there was no safety, because Israel, which had been paralyzed by fear, was now energized by faith. The men of Israel and Judah rose with a war cry that echoed through the hills. 40 days of humiliation, 40 days of powerlessness, 40 days of hearing taunts without being able to respond. All of this exploded in a wave of renewed courage. They took up their weapons, formed makeshift ranks, and advanced. Not as a hesitant and fearful army, but as confident, inspired warriors, convinced that God was with them. The pursuit was relentless. The Israelites chased after the fleeing Philistines, catching them, striking them down, giving them no respite. The valley that had been the scene of a stalemate now became the scene of an overwhelming victory. The ground was marked with the traces of the Philistine flight: abandoned weapons, discarded helmets, sandals lost in the rush, and bodies, many bodies. The Bible records that the wounded Philistines fell along the road from Shaaraim to Gath and Ekron. It was a total, devastating, irreversible defeat. But the victory didn't stop at the pursuit. When the Israelite soldiers returned, they found the Philistine camps completely abandoned. Tents were still pitched, fires still burning, food still prepared. The Philistines had fled in such haste that they left everything behind, and Israel plundered everything. Weapons, armor, provisions, treasures, everything the Philistines had brought now belonged to Israel. It was a complete reversal. The people who had trembled with fear now celebrated victory. The army that had been mocked now reaped spoils. There was something profoundly transformative about that moment. It wasn't just a military victory. It was a spiritual restoration. Israel had forgotten who it was: God's people, the chosen nation, those who carried the divine promise. 40 days of fear had eroded their identity, their confidence, their faith. But the courage of a young shepherd had rekindled all of that. David hadn't fought alone. He had fought as Israel's representative, and when he won, Israel won with him. The soldiers returned to camp carrying spoils, singing, celebrating, telling and retelling the story of what they had witnessed. "Did you see? The stone hit him right in the forehead. He fell like a tower. The boy used the giant's own sword." The stories multiplied, the details were exaggerated, but the essence remained true. God had given victory, and he had used someone no one expected. The courage of one had rekindled the faith of many. The faith of one young man had renewed the faith of a nation. The obedience of one shepherd had liberated a people. And all this because David had understood something fundamental. The battle belongs to the Lord. It doesn't matter the size of the enemy. It doesn't matter how many days of fear you have faced. It doesn't matter how many voices say it's impossible. When you trust in God and act in obedience, he transforms the impossible into a testimony of his glory. The valley of Elah, which had been a scene of stalemate and terror, was now a scene of victory and celebration. The name of David, which was unknown in Israel in the morning, was now sung throughout the camp at nightfall. And Goliath, who had seemed invincible for 40 days, was now just a headless corpse, a permanent reminder that no giant is too big for the God of Israel. The victory was complete, but David knew that victories need to be remembered, not for personal glory, but because what had happened in the valley of Elah was not just a battle won, it was a testimony to God's power that needed to echo through the generations. Testimonies are lost when there is nothing tangible to support them. Stories fade when there are no objects to anchor them in reality. Therefore, David made deliberate decisions about what to do with Goliath's spoils. The giant's head was the first trophy. David carried it with him, not hidden but visibly for all to see. He took it to Jerusalem, which at that time was not yet the capital of Israel, but was already a significant city, a place where the testimony would be preserved and remembered. Goliath's head was not just a war trophy, it was a theological statement in physical form. It was proof that the God of Israel is greater than any giant, more powerful than any army, more faithful than any circumstance suggests. Every person who saw that enormous head, with the bronze helmet still attached, was forced to confront the reality. The impossible had happened, but David didn't stop at the head. He took Goliath's weapons, the magnificent sword, the spear like a loom's cylinder, the bronze dart, perhaps even parts of the armor, and kept them in his own tent. Not to display them as personal trophies, but to preserve them as a memory. Years later, when David was fleeing from Saul and needed a weapon, he would specifically ask for Goliath's sword, which had been kept in the sanctuary of Nob, wrapped in cloth behind the ephod. That sword would become part of David's history, an object that carried memory, meaning, testimony. There was something profound in the way David treated these objects. He understood that memory is fragile. People forget. Details are lost. Stories are distorted over time, but objects remain. They are silent witnesses that speak through generations. Goliath's sword was not just forged metal, it was a sermon in the form of a weapon. Every time someone saw it, the story was retold. Every time it was mentioned, faith was renewed. Every time it was remembered, God was glorified. The Israelite soldiers also brought back trophies. They looted Philistine camps, taking weapons, armor, and provisions. Each object carried home would become a story told to their children. "See this spear? I picked it up the day young David killed Goliath. You should have seen it. The giant fell like a tower, and we chased the Philistines all the way to Gath." These stories would be told around campfires, at celebrations, in moments of doubt when Israel needed to remember that God is faithful. But the most important trophy wasn't physical, it was the name, David. Before that day, he was just the name of a shepherd from Bethlehem, the youngest son of Jesse, someone no one outside his town knew. But after the valley of Elah, that name began to echo. First among the soldiers who witnessed the victory, then among the families who heard the stories, then among the cities that received the spoils, and eventually throughout Israel. David killed Goliath. David defeated the giant. David trusts in God. The name became synonymous with courage, faith, and impossible victory. There were also invisible but equally powerful trophies, Israel's renewed confidence, the reminder that God was still with his people, the certainty that size doesn't determine the outcome when God is involved. These trophies couldn't be touched or displayed, but they were felt, lived, transmitted. Each soldier who returned home carried with him not only physical spoils, but a renewed faith. Each family that heard the story was reminded that the God of their fathers was still powerful. Each child who grew up hearing about David and Goliath learned that courage comes from trusting in God, not from trusting in oneself. David kept Goliath's weapons, but he didn't hide them. He preserved them as a testament, because he knew there would be difficult days ahead. He knew Israel would face other enemies, other challenges, other moments of fear. And in those moments, it would be crucial to remember, God gave us victory over Goliath. He can give us victory again. Objects that speak, trophies that bear witness, memories that sustain faith, and a name that began to echo not only in Israel, but in the history of humanity. As David marched toward Goliath, something curious happened in the Israelite camp. Saul, the king who had given permission for the young shepherd to fight, turned to Abner, the commander of his army, and asked a question that seemed strange at first glance. "Abner, whose son is this young man?" And Abner, with complete honesty, replied, "As surely as you live, your majesty, I don't know." How was this possible? David had already played the harp for Saul. He had already been to the palace. He had already served the king personally. How could Saul not know who he was? There are several possible explanations. Perhaps Saul, tormented by evil spirits, didn't pay much attention to who was playing for him. What mattered was that the music calmed his torment. Perhaps David had traveled back and forth between the palace and Bethlehem several times, not being a permanent member of the court. Perhaps Saul's question wasn't so much about David's name, but about his lineage, his family, his origin. Crucial information because Saul had promised great riches, his daughter in marriage, and tax exemption to the family of the man who killed Goliath. Saul said to Abner, "Find out whose son this young man is." It wasn't casual curiosity. It was a political and legal necessity. If David defeated Goliath, there would be significant consequences. His family would be elevated. He would become the king's son-in-law. There would be alliances, commitments, implications that would affect the power structure of Israel. Saul needed to know, who is this young man? Where does he come from? Who is his father? What kind of family produces someone with this courage? Then David returned from the battle, still carrying Goliath's head, and Abner brought it before Saul. The scene is laden with symbolism. There stood the anointed king whom God had rejected, before the anointed young man whom God had chosen. There stood the man who had lost divine trust, before the young man who lived by faith. There stood the leader paralyzed by fear, before the shepherd energized by courage. And Saul, perhaps without fully grasping the significance of the moment, asked the question, "Whose son are you, young man?" David's answer was simple, direct, and unpretentious. "I am the son of your servant, Jesse of Bethlehem." There was no arrogance in those words, no attempt to exalt himself. David had just accomplished the most extraordinary feat Israel had witnessed in decades, but his identity remained rooted in humility. "Son of your servant." He didn't say son of the man Samuel secretly anointed, or son of the one God chose to be the next king. He simply identified his father, his city, his common origin. But that simple answer carried weight. Jesse of Bethlehem. An ordinary family from a small town. No royal lineage, no impressive military tradition, nothing that could humanly explain how that young man had done what he did. And perhaps that was precisely the point. God doesn't choose based on pedigree. He doesn't look for impressive resumes or powerful connections. He looks at the heart. And the heart of David, son of Jesse of Bethlehem, was a heart after God's own heart. Saul looked at David, that red-haired youth, still holding the giant's head, covered in dust and blood, but with eyes shining with faith, and must have felt something complex. Perhaps admiration, perhaps envy, perhaps a premonition that this young man represented something he himself had lost. The Bible doesn't record what Saul thought at that moment, but it does record what happened afterward. Jonathan, Saul's son, became deeply attached to David in friendship, and Saul would eventually begin to see him as a threat. But at that moment, in the heat of victory, with Israel celebrating and the Philistines fleeing, David stood before the king, from the pasture to the palace, from anonymity to recognition, from shepherd to giant slayer. And the question that hung in the air, not only for Saul but for all who witnessed it, was profound. And now, What happens to a young man whom God uses in such an extraordinary way? How will he cope with sudden fame? How will you remain faithful when everyone knows you? How will you keep your heart humble when your name echoes everywhere? The answers to these questions would unfold in the years to come. But at that moment, David was simply the son of Jesse of Bethlehem, standing before the king holding Goliath's head and carrying within him the secret anointing that would one day lead him to the throne, from the pasture to the palace. And the journey was only beginning. When the dust of battle settled and the clamor of victory began to fade, there was something that needed to be understood, something that went beyond the stone, beyond the sling, beyond even the impressive courage of a young shepherd. What had truly happened in the valley of Elah was not merely a military victory. It was the revelation of a divine principle that runs throughout the history of redemption. God does not see as humans see. Humans look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. When Samuel arrived at Jesse's house on that seemingly ordinary day, he saw 7 impressive sons. Eliab had the stature, the looks, everything that seemed to qualify someone for leadership. The others also had their qualities, their strengths, their visible attributes. But God rejected them all, not because they were bad or inadequate for other things, but because they lacked what he sought. And what he sought could not be seen with human eyes. It was something internal, profound, essential. It was a heart. David was anointed not because he was the strongest, the tallest, the most experienced, or the most impressive. He was anointed because his heart was different. And what made his heart different? Not perfection. David would make serious mistakes throughout his life. Not the absence of flaws. He was human like anyone else. What made his heart special was its fundamental orientation. He lived for the glory of God. Everything in his life revolved around this centrality. When he cared for the sheep, it wasn't just work. It was stewardship before God. When he played the harp, it wasn't just music, it was worship. When he faced predators, it wasn't just protecting the flock. It was confidence that God would empower him. This guidance of the heart was forged in secret places, in the lonely hills of Bethlehem, where no one but God was watching. On cold nights under the stars, when David conversed with the Creator through songs. In moments of danger, when he learned that God is faithful even when no one else is around. David was trained in secrecy. His faithfulness was tested and proven when there was no audience, when there was no recognition, when there was nothing but the awareness of doing what was right in God's eyes. And it was precisely this faithfulness in the small things that prepared him for the great. When David told Saul, "Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear," he wasn't boasting. He was testifying to God's faithfulness in situations that no one but him had seen. Those secret victories became the foundation of his public confidence. Those moments of total dependence on God in the hills became the basis of his courage in the valley. God doesn't waste years of preparation. He uses every sheep protected, every predator faced, every note played on the harp, every prayer whispered in silence to mold the heart he needs for the right moment. When David heard Goliath mocking the armies of the living God, his reaction wasn't about national pride or personal honor. It was about the honor of God. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine to defy the armies of the living God? It wasn't about David proving anything. It was about God being glorified. It wasn't about Israel gaining reputation. It was about the name of the Lord being exalted. This centrality of God's glory was what pulsed in David's heart, and that's what God saw when he chose to anoint that young shepherd. The same heart that played the harp to calm the tormented king was the heart that wielded the sling to bring down the arrogant giant. The same heart that tenderly cared for the sheep was the heart that bravely confronted the enemy. The same heart that worshipped in secret was the heart that testified in public. They were not different hearts for different situations. It was the same heart guided by the same faith, motivated by the same passion, the glory of God. And here lies the beauty and the challenge of this truth. God still looks at the heart. He is still not impressed by outward appearances, impressive resumes, physical strength, or natural abilities. He seeks hearts that sincerely seek Him, that trust Him completely, that live for His glory above all else. He seeks people willing to be faithful in the small, the hidden, the unrecognized, knowing that it is there that character is forged and faith is tested. David wasn't perfect, but his heart was turned toward God. And when God finds a heart like that, he can do the impossible through it. He can bring down giants, he can liberate nations, he can transform shepherds into kings. He can use the unlikely, the underestimated, the forgotten, to reveal his glory in ways no one expected. Because in the end, it's not about who you are in the eyes of the world, it's about who you are in the eyes of God, and God sees the heart. The story of David and Goliath is not merely an ancient narrative recorded in the pages of Scripture. It is a mirror reflecting eternal truths, an invitation to examine our own lives, our own valleys, our own giants. Because if there is one thing this story teaches us with crystal clarity, it is this: the battle is the Lord's. It is not ours. It does not depend on us. It is not resolved by our strength, our intelligence, our resources. The battle belongs to the Lord, and he wins it how, when, and through whom he chooses. Each of us has a valley of Elah. Perhaps it's a professional challenge that seems impossible to overcome. Perhaps it's an illness that threatens to destroy everything. Perhaps it's a broken relationship that seems irreparable. Perhaps it's a deep fear that paralyzes and prevents you from moving forward. Perhaps it's a devastating financial circumstance. Perhaps it's a spiritual struggle that drains all your strength. Whatever it is, it's that place where two armies clash: faith against fear, hope against despair, trust against doubt. And there, in that space between what is and what should be, lies your giant. And every giant has a voice. Goliath shouted his taunts twice a day for 40 days. Your giant also speaks. He tells you that you are not capable, that you don't have what it takes, that it's too late or too early, or that you are too small, too inexperienced, too weak. He points to your past failures, your present limitations, your future uncertainties. And the more you listen, the more he seems to grow. The more you look at him with human eyes, the more invincible he seems. But here is the truth that David understood, and that changed everything. The size of the giant doesn't matter when you know the size of your God. Goliath was 3 meters tall, wore bronze armor, and had decades of military experience. But he was mortal. He was limited. He was just a man challenging the eternal, infinite, almighty God. And when you see your giant from that perspective, not as an impossible threat, but as an opportunity for God to reveal his glory, everything changes. David chose 5 smooth stones. What are your 5 stones? I'm not talking about physical weapons, but spiritual instruments that God has already placed in your hands. Perhaps it's the faith you cultivated in difficult times. Perhaps it's the experience of past victories when God delivered you from impossible situations. Perhaps it's the word of God that you memorized and that now sustains your soul. Perhaps it's the faith community that prays for you and with you. Perhaps it's the certainty that God is faithful, even when you don't see the way. These are your stones, and they are sufficient, not because they are powerful in themselves, but because they are placed in the hands of a God who never fails. David's sling was simple, ordinary, nothing impressive, but in the right hands at the right time, guided by God, it became the instrument of liberation for an entire nation. What you have in your hands may seem inadequate. It may seem too small for the challenge you face, but when you offer God what you have, when you trust Him instead of trusting yourself, when you act in obedience, even when it doesn't make sense in human eyes, God transforms the ordinary into the extraordinary. And here's the most important part. You don't need to be perfect. You don't need to have all the answers. You don't need to be the strongest, the most experienced, the most qualified. You just need to have a heart turned towards God, a heart that sincerely seeks Him, a heart that trusts Him completely, a heart that lives for His glory above all else. Because God doesn't look for ability, He looks for availability. He doesn't look for perfection, He looks for faith. He doesn't look for giants, He looks for hearts willing to trust Him in the face of giants. So where is your valley of Elah? What giant has been shouting taunts over your life? What are the 5 stones that God has already placed in your hands? And most importantly, are you willing to walk toward the impossible, trusting that the God who gave victory to David will give victory to you as well? Because the same promise that sustained that young shepherd sustains you today. The battle is the Lord's. He fights for you. He wins for you. He transforms your valley of fear into a testimony of faith. The story of David and Goliath didn't end that day in the valley of Elah. It continues to resonate every time someone chooses to trust in God instead of backing down from the impossible. Every time someone picks up their smooth stones and walks toward the giant. Every time someone declares, "I come in the name of the Lord of hosts." And today, that story can continue through you. Your valley is waiting. Your giant is roaring. But your God is faithful, and He is inviting you to trust in Him, to act in obedience, and to witness that when the battle belongs to the Lord, victory is certain. What are your 5 cornerstones? Where is your valley of Elah? And most importantly, are you ready to discover that the God of David is your God too? There are times in life when it seems like nothing is happening. You pray, you wait, you trust, but the circumstances remain unchanged. The days repeat themselves with the same routine, the challenges continue, and you begin to wonder if God really heard, if He really cares, if anything will change. David knew this silence well. Between the day Samuel poured oil on his head and the day he faced Goliath, there was a period of waiting. He was anointed king but continued tending sheep. He received the promise but remained anonymous. He carried the anointing but lived the routine. This time of silence was not wasted. It was preparation. God was working on him in ways no one saw, shaping his character in secret places, strengthening his faith through experiences that seemed ordinary but were essential. Each day in the hills was a lesson in dependence. Each confrontation with predators was a training in courage. Each song played in solitude was a building of intimacy with God. The silence was not divine absence. It was the workshop where God forged the instrument He would use at the right moment. If you are in a time of silence, don't be discouraged. Don't interpret quietness as rejection. Don't confuse preparation with forgetfulness. God doesn't waste seasons. He uses each one for something specific, something necessary, something that will make sense when the time comes. What seems to take a long time in your eyes may be exactly the time God needs to work in you on what will be essential tomorrow. David could not have faced Goliath without the years in the hills. The public victory was a direct result of private faithfulness, and the same principle applies to you. So remain faithful in the small things. Continue trusting in the hidden things. Continue worshiping when no one sees. Continue obeying even when you don't understand. Because God is preparing something, He is weaving a story that has not yet been revealed. He is positioning pieces that you cannot see. And when the right moment arrives, when your valley of Elah appears, you will discover that all that seemed like silence was, in fact, God working in secret for your public victory. The silence before the storm is not emptiness. It is a harbinger of something powerful that is about to happen. There is a profound difference between believing in God and trusting in God. Believing is intellectual assent. Trusting is total surrender. Believing says God can. Trusting says God will, and therefore I act. When David told Saul that the Lord would deliver him from the hands of Goliath, he was not merely expressing a theological belief. He was declaring a trust that would lead him to action. And when the moment arrived, David did not stand still waiting for God to do everything alone. He ran. The Bible clearly states, David ran toward the giant. This is faith in action. Faith that doesn't paralyze, but mobilizes. Faith that doesn't retreat, but advances. Faith that doesn't wait passively, but acts courageously. David trusted that God would grant victory, but he also knew he needed to pick up the stones, grasp the sling, aim, and shoot. God would do what only He could do, guide the stone, bring down the giant, grant victory. But David needed to do what was within his reach: obey, act, run. True faith always involves this mysterious partnership between divine sovereignty and human responsibility. How many times have we prayed for God to change our circumstances, but failed to take the step He expects us to take? How many times have we asked for victory, but failed to run toward the challenge? How many times have we cried out for deliverance, but remained paralyzed by fear? God does not call us to passivity disguised as spirituality. He calls us to active faith, to trust that moves, to obedience that runs. He parts the Red Sea, but you need to get into the water. He brings down the walls of Jericho, but you need to march around them. He gives victory over Goliath, but you need to grab the sling. So ask yourself, where is God waiting for you to run? What step of obedience have you been putting off out of fear? What action do you know you need to take, but have hesitated to take because it seems risky, difficult, impossible? Faith doesn't eliminate risk. Faith acts despite risk. Faith doesn't guarantee it will be easy. Faith guarantees God will be with you. Faith doesn't remove the giant before you get close. Faith empowers you to run toward the giant, trusting that God will fulfill his promise. David could have stood still, waiting for God to do everything. He could have prayed more, fasted more, waited for a clearer sign, but he knew the time had come to act. He had the promise, he had the anointing, he had the experience of past victories, he had the stones in his hands, and so he ran. Not with arrogance, but with confidence. Not with presumption, but with faith. Not trusting in himself, but trusting in God enough to move his feet, grasp the sling and do his part. And God did the rest. Because when faith becomes action, when trust transforms into obedience, when belief manifests in movement, that's when miracles happen. That's when giants fall. That's when the impossible becomes a testament to God's faithfulness. One of the deepest pains we can experience doesn't come from strangers, but from those close to us. When Eliab rebuked David on the battlefield, his words carried more than momentary disapproval. They carried years of shared experiences, of family hierarchy, of unfulfilled expectations. "I know your arrogance and the wickedness of your heart," he said. It wasn't just criticism. It was a judgment of character coming from someone who should have known him better. David faced something many of us face, the incomprehension of those who should support us. His brothers didn't see courage. They saw arrogance. They didn't recognize zeal for God. They interpreted it as a search for attention. They didn't celebrate his faith. They questioned his motives. And this hurts in a particular way because when your own family doesn't understand your calling, when those who grew up with you don't recognize what God is doing in you, the temptation is to give up, to retreat, to conform to the limited expectations they place on you. But David teaches us something essential. You cannot allow the misunderstanding of others to define your destiny. He didn't retaliate in anger. He didn't engage in prolonged arguments. He didn't try to convince Eliab that he was right. He simply walked away and continued doing what he knew God had called him to do. Because in the end, the approval that truly matters doesn't come from siblings, parents, friends, or any human being. It comes from God. And when you are certain that you are in the center of God's will, you can endure human disapproval. If you are facing misunderstanding from those close to you, if those who should be supporting you are criticizing you, if your family doesn't understand the calling God has placed in your heart, know that you are not alone. David went through this. Jesus went through this. His own brothers didn't believe in him until after the resurrection. It's painful, but it's not disqualifying. Don't let the voice of your brothers silence the voice of God. Keep obeying, keep trusting, keep moving forward, because there will be a day when those who didn't understand will see what God has done through you, and their misunderstanding will turn into a testimony of divine faithfulness. When Saul dressed David in his own armor, he was doing what seemed logical, sensible, and responsible. He was offering protection, equipment, everything a warrior would need. But there was a fundamental problem. That armor wasn't David's. It hadn't been made for him. It didn't fit his body, his style, his calling. And when David tried to walk in it, he discovered something crucial. You can't fight God's battle with someone else's identity. We live in a culture that constantly pressures us to wear armor that isn't ours. The armor of success, as the world defines it. The armor of the perfect appearance on social media. The armor of others' expectations about who we should be, how we should act, what we should achieve. And we try to wear this armor. We try to fit into these molds. We try to be who others expect us to be. But we discover, as David discovered, that we can't walk. The armor weighs us down, restricts us, limits us, because it wasn't made for us. David had the courage to take off his armor, to say, "I can't walk with this," to return to being who he truly was, a shepherd with a sling. And it was precisely by being authentically himself that God used him powerfully. Not an improved version, not an imitation of Saul, not a copy of some famous warrior. Just David, with his unique abilities, his particular experience, his specific gifts. And that was enough. God doesn't need you to be someone else. He needs you to be you, fully, authentically, without masks. He created you with purpose, shaped you with intention, and equipped you uniquely. The experiences you've had, the skills you've developed, even the difficulties you've faced, all of this is part of who you are and how God intends to use you. Stop trying to wear someone else's armor. Stop comparing your calling to others. Stop thinking you need to be different from who God made you to be useful. Take off the armor that doesn't fit. Be authentically yourself, and discover that God has already perfectly equipped you for the battle He is calling you to fight. Your sling is sufficient. Your stones are adequate. Your heart turned towards God is all He needs to do the impossible through you. When David spoke of the lion and the bear, he was revealing something no one knew. Those battles had taken place far from human eyes, in the lonely hills, without witnesses, without applause, without recognition. But they had happened, and they had left marks. Not just on the body, perhaps, but certainly on the soul. Invisible scars of tested courage, of proven faith, of God experienced as faithful. We all have these invisible scars. Battles we fought in secret, victories we won when no one was watching, moments when God delivered us, and only He and we know. Maybe it was that night you thought about giving up on everything, but God gave you the strength to continue. Maybe it was that temptation that almost destroyed you, but you chose to obey even when it was difficult. Maybe it was that devastating loss that could have broken you, but God sustained you in ways no one saw. These are your secret victories, your invisible scars, your lions and bears. And here's the powerful truth. Those victories no one saw are exactly what prepares you for the battles everyone will see. David couldn't have faced Goliath publicly if he hadn't faced the lion privately. The courage in the valley was built on the hills. The faith before thousands was forged in solitude. The public testimony was the result of private faithfulness. God doesn't waste your secret battles. He uses them to prepare you for something greater. So don't underestimate the struggles you face away from the spotlight. Don't think that because no one sees it, it doesn't matter. Don't underestimate the value of the victories that only you and God know. Each one is shaping you, strengthening you, preparing you. Each invisible scar is a medal of honor before God. Each secret battle won is a step on the ladder that leads you to your purpose. And when your valley of Elah arrives, when the moment comes when everyone will be watching, you will discover that those victories that no one saw gave you exactly what you need to overcome what everyone will see. Between David and Goliath, there was a stream, a small detail in the narrative, easily overlooked, but profoundly significant. David didn't go straight from the camp to the confrontation. He stopped. He knelt. He carefully chose stones. He prepared himself. That stream represented the space between decision and action, between commitment and confrontation, between declared faith and demonstrated faith. And what David did in that space was crucial. Often we want to jump straight to victory. We want to go from the problem to the solution without the process. We want to face the giant without stopping at the stream. But God often places streams in our path, moments of pause, of preparation, of careful choice. They are not delays, they are opportunities. They are not obstacles, they are provisions. In that stream were the stones David needed. If he had rushed past, he would have missed the instrument of his victory. What's in your stream? What is God offering in the space between where you are and where you need to be? Perhaps it's prayer time you've been neglecting. Perhaps it's wisdom you need to seek. Perhaps it's relationships you need to strengthen. Perhaps it's healing you need to receive. Perhaps it's forgiveness you need to grant. Perhaps it's rest you need to accept. Don't jump the stream. Don't ignore the preparation. Don't underestimate what God wants to give you along the way. David chose 5 stones, not 1. He prepared properly, not minimally. He took time to make wise, not hasty choices. And when he finally stood and walked toward Goliath, he was ready. Not because he had all the answers, but because he had made the preparation that God placed in his path. So stop at your stream, kneel down, choose your stones carefully, prepare well, because the victory that lies ahead depends on the preparation you make now. And God, in His wisdom, always places exactly what you need between you and your giant. David had no sword. He had refused Saul's, and his own sling was not enough to secure the victory. But when Goliath fell, there was the solution, the giant's own sword. God provided the ultimate instrument of victory through the enemy himself. The weapon that should have destroyed David became the weapon that sealed Goliath's defeat. This was no coincidence. It was divine providence with a dose of poetic irony. There is something profoundly encouraging in this detail. Sometimes God uses the very weapons the enemy has raised against you to give you the ultimate victory. That difficulty that should destroy you becomes what strengthens you. That rejection that should break you becomes what redirects you to your true purpose. That loss that should defeat you becomes what teaches you dependence on God. The enemy's sword in God's hands becomes an instrument of liberation. Joseph experienced this. His brothers sold him into slavery, trying to destroy his dreams. But it was precisely through that betrayal that God led him to Egypt, where he would become second in command and save not only his family, but entire nations. The weapon that should have killed him became the path to his destiny. Jesus experienced this supremely. The cross, the instrument of execution, became the means of salvation. Death, which should have been the end, became the door to resurrection. The enemy's greatest weapon became God's greatest victory. So look at the difficulties you are facing with different eyes. What seems to be a sword raised against you may be exactly what God will use for your deliverance. That challenge that seems impossible may be what takes you to the next level of faith. That situation that seems hopeless may be where God reveals a provision you never imagined. Do not fear the enemy's sword, because when God is in control, even the weapons raised against you work in your favor. And you will discover, as David discovered, that ultimate victory often comes through what seemed to be your greatest threat. The story usually ends with Goliath fallen and Israel celebrating. But there was a next day. David woke up the following morning no longer as an anonymous shepherd, but as a national hero. His name was on everyone's lips. His deeds were recounted and retold. Expectations of him had completely changed. And with victory came something he perhaps didn't expect: responsibility. Saul wouldn't let him return home. Jonathan became deeply attached to him in friendship. The people began to sing about him. His life would never be the same again. Victories bring consequences. When God gives you a public victory, when He uses you visibly, when your testimony becomes known, your life changes. People start to look at you differently. Expectations rise, the pressure grows. And you need to learn to deal with the day after the victory, which is sometimes more challenging than the day of the battle. Because on the day of the battle, you are focused, adrenaline is high, purpose is clear. But the day after, you need to live with the consequences, manage the changes, maintain humility amidst the recognition. David would face immense challenges in the years to come. Saul's envy, relentless persecution, forced exile, the prolonged wait between anointing and coronation. Killing Goliath was only the beginning of a long and complex journey, and he would have to learn to remain faithful, not only in the moment of victory, but in the years of consequences that would follow. He would have to learn that being used by God doesn't mean everything will be easy from then on. Sometimes it means exactly the opposite. If God has recently given you a victory, if He has visibly used you, if something has changed in your life because of His faithfulness, prepare for the day after. Prepare for the new responsibilities that come with public witness. Prepare for the expectations people will place on you. Prepare for the challenges that arise precisely because you were faithful. And most importantly, prepare to maintain the same humble heart you had before the victory. The danger lies not in victory itself, but in how you handle it. David could have become arrogant, self-confident, dependent on his own strength, but he didn't. Even years later, even as king, he remained the man who knew that victory comes from God, not from himself. He continued to worship, continued to depend, continued to recognize that without God, he was nothing. This sustained humility is what separates those who have a victory from those who live a life of continuous faithfulness. So celebrate your victories, yes. Thank God for them, acknowledge His faithfulness, testify to what He has done, But don't stop there. Prepare for the day after. Keep your heart turned toward God. Continue seeking His face as you sought it before the victory. Continue depending on Him as you depended on Him when you were facing the giant. Because the journey doesn't end with a victory. It continues. And each victory is merely preparation for the next phase of what God is doing in you and through you. The day after the victory is just as important as the day of the battle, and God will be with you in both. Perfect. I'll continue from where I left off and complete the 6th extra topic, followed by the final conclusion, the day after. When victory becomes responsibility, continued. If God has recently given you a victory, if He has visibly used you, if something has changed in your life because of His faithfulness, prepare for the day after. Prepare for the new responsibilities that come with public witness. Prepare for the expectations people will place on you. Prepare for the challenges that arise precisely because you were faithful. And most importantly, prepare to maintain the same humble heart you had before the victory. The danger lies not in victory itself, but in how you handle it. David could have become arrogant, self-confident, dependent on his own strength, but he didn't. Even years later, even as king, he remained the man who knew that victory comes from God, not from himself. He continued to worship, continued to depend, continued to recognize that without God, he was nothing. This sustained humility is what separates those who have a victory from those who live a life of continuous faithfulness. So celebrate your victories, yes. Thank God for them, acknowledge His faithfulness, testify to what He has done. But don't stop there. Prepare for the day after, keep your heart turned toward God, continue seeking His face as you sought it before the victory. Continue depending on Him as you depended on Him when you were facing the giant. Because the journey doesn't end with a victory, it continues, and each victory is merely preparation for the next phase of what God is doing in you and through you. The day after the victory is just as important as the day of the battle, and God will be with you in both. And so we come to the end of this profound journey through the valley of Elah, where we walked alongside a young shepherd who became a giant in faith, though small in the eyes of the world. We visited the lonely hills of Bethlehem, where faithfulness was forged far from the spotlight. We were present in Jesse's house, when the anointing oil was poured on someone no one expected. We heard the thundering voice of Goliath echoing for 40 days, and felt the weight of the fear that paralyzed an entire nation. We saw David arrive with bread and cheese, unaware that he was carrying much more than provisions. He was carrying the destiny of Israel. We heard his righteous indignation at the affront to the living God. We felt the tension when he refused Saul's armor and chose to be authentically himself. We knelt with him by the stream, choosing smooth stones that would become instruments of liberation. We held our breath when he ran toward the giant, when the sling spun in the air, when the stone flew with divine precision. We witnessed the impossible, the colossus falling, the enemy's own sword being used against it, the giant's head being raised as a testament that God fulfills His promises. We saw Israel run in victory after 40 days of fear. We watched the trophies being stored, the memory being fixed, the name of David beginning to echo, and we reflected on the heart that God saw, not perfect, but turned toward Him, not without flaws, but full of faith. But this story isn't just about David. It's about you, about me, about each one of us who faces our own giants, who walks through our own valleys, who must choose between retreating in fear or advancing in faith. It's about the God who hasn't changed, who continues to look into the heart, who continues to use the improbable, who continues to give impossible victories to reveal His glory. I hope that throughout this narrative, you have found more than just an old story. I hope you have found hope for your difficult days, courage for your moments of fear, renewed faith for your impossible challenges. I hope you have been reminded that your giants are not bigger than your God, that your stones are enough when placed in His hands, that your faithfulness in secret is preparing you for public victories. Thank you for walking with me through every hill, every valley, every moment of this journey. Thank you for opening your heart to receive not just words, but eternal truths that can transform how you see your challenges. Thank you for dedicating this precious time to connecting with a story that, though ancient, remains alive, relevant, and powerful. May you rest soundly tonight, enveloped in the peace of knowing that the same God who was with David is with you. May your dreams be peaceful, your soul renewed, your heart strengthened. And tomorrow, when you wake up and face your own giants, may you remember, the battle belongs to the Lord. You are not alone, you are not unqualified, you are not without resources. You have the name of the Lord of hosts, and that is more than enough. Good night, dear friend. May God bless your rest, illuminate your path, and always remind you that He sees your heart, and what He sees is someone loved, chosen, empowered to do the impossible through Him. Sleep in peace. And we will meet again soon for more stories that soothe the soul, strengthen faith, and remind us that we serve a God who transforms shepherds into kings and stones into instruments of liberation. Rest well. Your victory is closer than you imagine, and God is already preparing the stones you will need. Good night, and see you in the next video.